Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 391 of the FCPA Compliance Report. In this episode, I visit with Brian Burke. Brian is a partner at Sherman & Sterling in New York, and we take a look at the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy around its requirement for companies to stop employees from using text and other messaging apps which self-destruct or are not retained. This was a new requirement under the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy, something we had not heard from the Department of Justice before, and many companies have struggled with how to implement this in the age of WhatsApp, text messaging, and other apps which allow or will self-destruct or delete themselves after a certain period of time. We talk about all of this in the context of document control and retention, how the Department of Justice expects companies to address this issue, some practical steps that Brian has developed for his clients, and his advice for companies going forward. It's a fascinating exploration of a new issue which has been brought about solely from the advances in technology really unrelated to, obviously, FCPA enforcement. These are phone apps and messaging apps and text apps, which are all a part of communications. It's something that, as a compliance practitioner, you're going to need to consider and write into your corporate policies around communications. This is Tom Fox. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm back for another episode, and you're in for a real treat today because I have Brian Burke. Brian is a partner at Sherman & Sterling. He is a white-collar practitioner, and he is going to visit with us today on a topic that, frankly, has bedeviled me since it became public knowledge, and that is part of the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy, which was announced at the end of November 2017 by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. And it deals with the problem of messaging apps which cause the message to disappear. So that's the introduction. And Brian, first of all, thank you for taking time to visit with me, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
So, Brian, in the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy that was announced, it stated that one of the items required for a company to receive full credit for both timely and appropriate remediation was, quote, appropriate retention of business records and prohibiting the improper destruction or deletion of business records, including prohibiting employees from using software that generates but does not appropriately retain business records or communications. I would say every time I've talked to someone like yourself, who is a white-collar practitioner, they have emphasized that getting control of your documents is, if not the first step to do, certainly 1A in any white-collar investigation. And it's something that either you're going to be challenged on when you go to the Department of Justice, or you actually proactively report that to the Department of Justice. So that part's not new. But what is new is the line about software that generates destruction of business records. So I really wanted to get a perspective from someone like yourself who deals with investigations as part of your practice. How does this come into play with the greater problem, or at least greater question, of appropriate business record retention, getting control of your documents, and those issues?
Well, I think it's a question of technology. In today's age, you have all kinds of technology for people to communicate. And 30 years ago, there was mainly the telephone and writing in the mail. But now these forms of communication have really proliferated, and they've become literally instantaneous, instant messaging. And so that has, as you said, the need to retain documents or data in the form of whatever form it takes is not new, but the forms that those data have taken is completely new, and is changing every year, every month, every quarter. Seems like there's a new app coming out that the people are using, employees and individuals around the world, to communicate, and it's extremely successful. these apps. I mean, you've seen apps with billions of users, literally over 1 billion users communicating on instant messaging apps. So the proliferation of these forms of technology and the speed with which people communicate, that's what really has prompted the DOJ, at least. It's not, so far it's just the DOJ to have addressed something like this in writing. But that's what has prompted the DOJ to do something about it. Now, there's a debate about whether they're doing the right thing about it, but at least they're trying to address the issue that employees are communicating in many different ways. And these days, the ways that people communicate does not always leave a record. And so you have a question of evidence that vanishes into thin air. Tom, are you there? I can't hear you.
Yes, I've had the occasion to communicate with people overseas, even on a commercial basis, where WhatsApp was an acceptable method of communication. But there are other technologies that many business people would use on a routine basis. So how does a company begin to, number one, assess their potential risk in this area, and then two, move to remediate that risk, if I can use some compliance terms?
Sure. I think it's a futile battle to try to prohibit employees entirely from using instant messaging for all the reasons that I just mentioned. It is becoming the most common form of communication, not just personal communications, but business communications, especially in parts of the world like Asia, where companies have completely bypassed email. So the primary form of communication among employees is instant messaging apps, things like WeChat, which is the most popular instant messaging app in China. Most employees, I venture to say all employees in China, will have WeChat installed on their mobile phone, and that will be the way that they communicate, both with their friends, their family, in personal and social situations, but also for work communication. So they just don't use email these days. If you have an email account, you won't check it very frequently. So if I send an email to a client in China, they may never get it. They may not get it for weeks. And if I ask them, did they get my email? They'll say, well, why didn't you just send me a WeChat message? And the same is true in other parts of Asia, particularly Asia and Latin America, where email communication is not as necessary, or I should say, it hasn't been developed as for as long a period of time as in Europe and the U.S. In those countries, you have the cell phone being the primary form of communication. People have skipped landlines, and so they're using their mobile phones. And it's certainly easier to do an instant message with someone than to go log into your email account and send an email. So the remediation that's necessary for companies, if you call it that, is to get a handle on that. As I said, I don't think it's possible to have a blanket prohibition. And not only do I think it's impossible, I think it's unnecessary under any regime to have a blanket prohibition on instant messaging apps for employees. It's simply not doable. It's not practicable. And any solution that is in the direction of a blanket prohibition on instant messaging apps, I think, is doomed to failure. And any policy, if you want to have a written policy that the company has that says you cannot use instant messaging apps in company communications, you are inviting employees to violate the policy. It's just a real world fact that employees are going to communicate this way, whether you prohibit it or not. So what companies need to do then is to, as I said, get a handle on this, which means first understand the issue. Understand what kinds of technologies your employees are using. Is it WeChat or is it WhatsApp? Is it Facebook? Is it Skype? Is it Slack, Google Hangout? There are so many different kinds now. You want to understand which ones your employees are using, and that can be done quite easily by talking to your employees and by assuming that they're using the most popular apps, which is a very safe assumption now. So in China, as I said, all employees will be using WeChat. It is a very safe assumption to assume that your employees are using WeChat in China, and you know that now. You can't cover your ears and say you weren't aware of this. It is a known fact. So to get a handle on that, then you have to understand how WeChat works. And this is where the technology comes in. WeChat is an instant messaging app, similar to WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, but it's more than that. On WeChat, you can engage in financial transactions. You can order a meal. You can buy products. You can do all sorts of things on WeChat that is happening outside of the company's network. So the technology is very powerful. You have employees engaging in transactions, financial transactions, on behalf of the company without having to use any of the company resources. Now, that's almost by definition an off-the-books transaction. So once you understand that the employees are using these applications, and then you understand a bit more about how the applications work, then the question becomes, how do you capture the information that's traveling over these apps? And that's the hardest part. These apps are designed to have instantaneous transfer of information. You can attach documents, substantive documents. You could have an M&A deal that's negotiated entirely over instant messaging apps by attaching drafts you can negotiate the terms in the draft contract and send it back and forth, entirely outside the company's network. Now, how do you capture that? The simple answer is you don't, as a matter of practice. Typically, you do not. If employees are using WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or WeChat, those communications are happening off the grid, so to speak. The company is not capturing them because they're going over the cloud. Very, very different from email, where it's traveling over the company's servers or on a network that the company can get access to. For instance, if it has a Google Mail application, you can log in. You can have an administrator, an IT person who is managing the communications, and you can access those communications. You can search them. Very important in investigations. You can search those emails, and you can download them, and you can review them, and you can produce them, and you can produce them to the government, and you can confront witnesses with their own communications. And that's why email is such an important part of doing an investigation, except that nowadays emails are being used less and less. So instant messaging is becoming the new form of evidence, just like email was, the new form of extremely important evidence of how employees are communicating with each other, what they are saying to each other, what kinds of transactions are being discussed. Just like you would search emails, you go to the instant messaging apps and you want to search those. The difficulty arises in trying to collect that information. If you want to get your employees' WhatsApp messages, you have nowhere to get them from on the company's network. You have to go outside the company's network. Same thing with WeChat and Facebook Messenger. You have to ask for the employee's permission to get access to their account. And usually these are personal accounts that are being used for work. So you have to get the employee's consent, and then you might be collecting more information than you want to get. You might be getting their personal information. Or the employees, for that very reason, may not give you consent because they have all kinds of communications on there. Some may relate to work, but some may not be related to work. Communications with their friends and family. And it's very difficult to, once you get access to somebody's account, it's very difficult to say, well, I'm only interested in the work emails, or rather the work messages. I'm not interested in the personal messages. In a instant message app, they're all intermingled. You can have thousands of messages in a given week or a given month, some personal, some work related. So the real challenge arises for companies on how to capture that information in a way that it can be reviewed and used in investigation. That's exactly why the DOJ is doing this. They're putting that onus on the company to say, we want the evidence. The DOJ said, I want the evidence from you, the company. Therefore, you have to have a system in place that allows you to capture the evidence and give it to us when we ask for it. Sounds easy, but it's very difficult in practice.
So we haven't even begun to overlay any data privacy laws that have come into play after this. And I typically look at these types of issues from either the corporate compliance perspective or occasionally from the perspective of someone like yourself who must capture this information and utilize it in determining a particular fact pattern under anti-corruption laws such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But when you overlay a data privacy regime such as GDPR, I can only begin to think it's going to become, if not exponentially more difficult, double exponentially more difficult in light of many of the things that you just said in terms of capturing private information, obtaining informed consent, and then retaining that information for a period of time that would be an appropriate time for the DOJ, yet not violate anything under GDPR.
Yeah, these things are coming to a head at the same time. You're exactly right. That's what makes this so challenging. I would also say that's what makes it so interesting for compliance professionals and counsel and people in the community to look at this problem. It's not just one problem. It's multiple. It's like a perfect storm coming together all at once, all of these factors. And you're absolutely right. Data privacy and instant messaging, collection of instant messaging are almost antithetical. Instant messaging is usually a personal communication, but it has become a work communication. So you have a personal mode of communication becoming in scope for the company. It is the data privacy and collection of instant messaging data are on a collision course. And the DOJ has basically said to the company, you sort this out, not us. It's not up to the government to sort it out. And so companies are understandably scratching their heads. The reason I think it may not be as big a problem as companies may be concerned about is that I think the DOJ will be receptive to a conversation about this, saying, listen, DOJ, you're asking us to do X, but then the European Union is asking us to do Y. These two things are irreconcilable, so we're trying to do the best of both. And the DOJ is certainly not going to say, sorry, you have to comply with our laws and to the expense of everything else. They're going to say, well, tell me what exactly you did to try to find that middle ground. And if the measures that you take are reasonable and bona fide and have some effectiveness and some success, then I think the DOJ will be open to giving you credit, and which is the whole reason why you're speaking to the DOJ in this context in the first place. You're voluntarily self-disclosing. So you've checked that box. You're doing the investigation as best you can, which is the second prong of the cooperation credit under the new enforcement policy. And then you're committing to effective and appropriate remediation. That's where the prohibition on instant messaging is buried in the DOJ's policy. But remember, the DOJ's policy is not mandatory. They do not have to apply every bullet of the new policy to every case that walks in the door. They have discretion. And as the policy now it's less than a year old, and instant messaging is a very new and extremely dynamic mode of communication. And as the GDPR, which is also very new, just came into effect in May, as these things come together, I absolutely think, and I certainly hope, that the DOJ will be receptive to a conversation that says, look, we're trying to juggle all of these balls at the same time, and we are certainly respecting the spirit of what you're after here. Here are the steps that we've taken. While not instituting a blanket prohibition on instant messaging, and you can explain to the DOJ why that's not reasonable. You can say every single employee in China, you could have 20,000 employees in China, every one of them is using instant messaging. Same thing in India. WhatsApp is more common than email in India. And in certain Latin America, WhatsApp is the most popular as well. And in Europe and the U.S., instant messaging is becoming if not a dominant, then at least a very common medium of work communication. So you can speak to the DOJ that you say, we're not able to stem the flow. The instant messaging is more powerful than one company. It is taking over the world, literally. The world is communicating on an instantaneous basis. Who are we to try to stop that. But what we're trying to do, DOJ, is to get our hands around it so we can at least be in a position to look at the data that they're sending. And of course, in the DOJ's interest, be in a position to provide that information to you. So I think they will be amenable to a conversation in that direction as long as the efforts that you're taking are bona fide and effective. And I can a couple of those things that you can do, for instance, to show this type of to show that you're making a bona fide effort at remediation and collection of this evidence. For instance, you can require your employees to back up their instant messaging. Okay, it can be done. You can say to your employees, if you're going to use instant messaging for work communication, we're not going to outright prohibit that. But if you do that, you have to back up your instant messaging so that we have a record of it. That's completely reasonable in my view. It's the same thing as saying if you're going to use company email, the company will have a copy of it. You would never say it's unreasonable for a company to have copies of the emails that are being sent over its system. So similarly, if you're going to engage in work using WhatsApp, then you have to back it up so that the company can have access to it. I think that's a reasonable step that a company can take for employees that use these types of communications. It's also not incredibly burdensome at the end of every week for an employee to back up their instant messaging. There are some ways of connecting your phone. When you connect your phone to your computer, it automatically backs up the instant messaging apps. And then once it's on your computer, it can be put onto the company's network quite easily. So sure, it's an extra step or two. Then email, for instance, email is just being backed up. If you're using company email, it's going through the company server, so they'll always retain a copy of it. It is an extra step, but I think it's a small step to take when you think about how powerful instant messaging apps are, and you're still allowing employees to harness that power, and you're doing so in a way that doesn't put the company in a bad position, or it doesn't compromise the company's position if you speak to the DOJ. So we require employees to back it up once a week. You can also say that we have policies that dictate reasonable use. Like DOJ will always ask you to provide the policies. What do your policies say about instant messaging apps? It's the first question they'll probably ask when you get into this topic. You say, well, our policies, first of all, you want your policies to say something. If you say if the policies are silent, you're going to have some explaining to do to the DOJ, because now this policy, now the government's view is out there. The DOJ's view is out there. It's publicized. You're on notice. So I think your company corporate policy should address the use of instant messaging apps. As I've been saying, it doesn't need to be a blanket prohibition, but it can be a protocol of reasonable use. You use it for this, not for that. Same way that we talk about company resources. Use it for this, not for that. If you want to seek reimbursement for a business expense, it can be for this type of meal, but not that type of meal. For this type of event, but not that type of event. So just add instant messaging into that discourse in the policy. Here's what you can use instant messaging for. Here's what you cannot use instant messaging for. And employees are grown-ups. They should be able to follow those rules. And if they don't, then they're violating the company's policies in the same way that if they were misusing company resources. I think there are practical measures companies can take. It's an effort, and it requires some advice and discussion and some movement among maybe in the training. Certainly it has to be updated. The policies, written policies have to be updated, and the employees need to be held accountable for it. But all of that applies to corruption and bribery as well. Your policies need to address it. Your training needs to address it. Employees need to be held accountable. This is, for instance, using company cash, using a corporate credit card. That's a powerful tool. You allow employees to use corporate credit cards, but you give them directions and instructions on how to use it. I look at instant messaging in that way. It's a powerful tool. Employees should not be prohibited from using it. It can be very much greatly to the benefit of the company for doing deals, but you need to create boundaries around it. If you do that, You go into the DOJ and you voluntarily self-disclose because you want to get the presumption of a declination. You want to get that highly coveted cooperation credit. If you've taken these steps around instant messaging, I think you're very far along. You can easily, I think, justify and defend the company's position on instant messaging if you have taken these steps.
So, Brian, you said something early on in the podcast which really struck me and it seemed to me almost everything you said flowed from that. And it was along the lines of the following, that perhaps 10, certainly 20 years ago, it would not be uncommon to transact business with internal to an organization or externally with a third party or even a counterparty using email. But now you can have that same business transaction via instant messaging app on your cell phone. And you provided the example of attaching documents. You also talked about attaching receipts for reimbursement, things like that. And you even, I think, used the example, you could do an entire M&A transaction literally using WhatsApp messaging. And if it really, what struck me was, I was thinking of WhatsApp messaging as simply a manner or mode of communication. But when you said that, it made me realize this is a platform by which you either communicate and or transact business. And if you think of it as a platform, there's always going to be a way to not only monitor the use of that platform, but capture how you use that platform. So maybe people, if I'm an example, and I was thinking along the lines was prior to visiting with you, and they rethink and recognize that an iPhone is a platform for transacting business in the modern world in places there where they may not have access to a computer or may be unreasonable or unfeasible. When you think about it that way, it really leads into all of the ideas that you suggested.
Yeah, that's right. The way to look at it is as a platform. It's not simply a mode of communicating. It's not simply just chatting with people. It's not maybe it started out that way. Instant messaging was, hey, what's up? I'll meet you at 3:00. Okay, see you there. Bring some food. That was what instant messaging was being used for, mainly for personal communications, for informal, if you can call them that, informal social interactions. The technology has advanced so far beyond that now that you really can engage in business effectively, probably even more effectively, I would say, using these types of apps, instant messaging, than using clunky old technology like email. Email is becoming almost obsolete. Why send me an email when you can literally send it to my pocket and it will come right up? And you can, the example I gave of an M&A transaction is not hypothetical. We are aware of M&A deals being negotiated over instant messaging. And that's not just, let's have a call at 3:00 or please send me the email. It is the actual the substance of the negotiations is traveling over WhatsApp or Messenger or WeChat. You used to have 5-10 years ago, you used to have a deal team, right? A deal team distribution list on the email. So you wouldn't have to write in 7 or 8 or 12 different names, the lawyers, the accountants, and the client, and the other side. You wouldn't. You'd have Project Phoenix, and that would be a distribution list. And you just write Project Phoenix, and it's all 15, 20 people it would go to. Now you have the same type of M&A deal team, but it's a WhatsApp group or a WeChat group. And so you send the message over that medium, and you attach the document and say, please see the marked up document attached. And you have the red line or the black line that's attached to that. And then people can look at it and they can come back and say, no, I don't agree with provision 4C. I want the indemnification cap to be X instead of Y. Real substantive communications. The other side came back, okay, here's a further revised version. Can you please, let's treat this as a final draft. And you have these correspondence. And then, as you said, not only attaching documents, but actual financial transactions. You can pay somebody. You can pay a vendor using the instant messaging apps. Venmo is one that is off the companies at this point. It's person to person, peer to peer payment. WeChat is probably the one that's most versatile, which is the most popular one in China and has over 1 billion users just in one country. Whereas Facebook Messenger has 1 billion users around the world. WeChat has 1 billion users in one country. On WeChat, you can do all kinds of things. Financial transactions. You can send people gifts. You send people gift certificates over it. You can order a meal. You can hire a car. You can order a taxi. It's like 7 or 8 different apps all rolled into one. And that's why, as you put it, that's why it's a platform. And if you say to your employee you can't use that, you're tying their hands. You don't want to tie your employees' hands. You want them to be efficient. You want them to get the car, get the taxi, make it to the client, do the deal, send the confirmation by as quickly as possible, go on to the next deal. You want to empower your employees to do more business. Well, then you have to let them use these extremely powerful platforms. But the problem is, behind all of that, I think we all can agree that instant messaging is incredibly powerful and versatile and the future, the present and the future. But the danger lurking behind all of that is that it's not automatically retained. It's in the air. It's ephemeral. It's in the cloud. Even calling it the cloud is something that neither you nor I can touch the cloud, right? It's up there somewhere. It's in the sky. So it's all great. It's all well and good to talk about the power and the versatility of instant messaging apps. But what the government, the DOJ, is interested in talking about is retention. And that takes effort. And that takes more effort than currently is the state of the art and the business, the industry standard, or just the business standard. It's not typical for companies to automatically retain employees' WhatsApp messages or WeChat or Facebook Messenger. It's actually difficult to do that because you have to get their consent, or you have to get an enterprise version of an instant messaging app like Skype. Skype can be transmitted over the company's network. You have Skype for Business. Even the name itself suggests that it's appropriate for business. Skype for Business. And I'll send you an instant message on Skype, and it will go over the company servers, and then you send me a response, and then if I wanted to, I could go to IT, and they could produce that. They could find that communication. The problem is, no one's using Skype for Business in the same way that they're using WhatsApp, WeChat, and Facebook Messenger. It just doesn't have the penetration. It's way down on the list. If you look at the data of the way of which instant messaging apps are being used, the top 3 are Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and WeChat. And then the next ones drop down by a huge margin. Those top 3 account for, I don't know what the number is, but over 60, maybe even 70% of the instant messaging communications is using one of those apps. The rest of them don't even keep up. So, yeah, it's nice that Skype for Business exists, and it's nice that it can travel over the company's network. But if I ask my client, sure, I'll send you a Skype for Business message, they'll say, what? They'll say, just send me a WhatsApp. So you have to be practical. You have to communicate in the way that your clients or your customers or your business partners communicate. Otherwise, business will grind to a halt. So that's why I think the key practical steps a company can take are, 1, to update your policies to address reasonable use of instant messaging apps. Number 2, update your training so that employees are aware that this is how, if you're going to use instant messaging apps for work, this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do. Then have a retention protocol that's both in the policy and the training that requires employees to back up their own correspondence. So in an M&A deal, like the example I gave of an M&A deal being negotiated over WhatsApp or WeChat, you have one person on the deal team who's responsible for backing it up once every 3 days. That's not uncommon where you have someone on the deal team is responsible for doing X or doing Y, making revisions to it. You generally have, the junior lawyer on the team who's the one who's turning the changes. Well, add to that person's responsibilities that they're going to be on the WeChat group, the WhatsApp group, that they also have to back it up. So at the end of the deal, you can say, all right, where's the file? Here's the deal file. It includes all the backed up communications. The junior lawyer is the one who's been responsible for keeping that. The law firm now has it, and it can put it into an archive. And then if the DOJ wants to look at it, or if the company needs to do an investigation, say, hey, who is the one that introduced that provision? Where's the communication that says, no, I want to revise provision 4C to be X instead of Y? You can go back and check for it if it is only if it's been backed up. So you can add into the policy and the training and the M&A deal protocol retention obligations. And then on the backside, you can audit that. And you can say when an audit team, now, an audit team, internal audit, when they do an internal audit, they always look at controls. That's what they're supposed to be looking at. What risks exist and what controls are in place to mitigate those risks. Well, they should add to their wheelhouse, looking at the instant messaging risks and whether the controls that the company has put into place, the ones I just named, are being followed. So audit teams should also be updated to look at this issue, so that when they run audits, the company gets a sense of the health. Just like any other control that an audit looks like, they'll be able to add this to their list. If you take all of these measures, I feel I'd be happy to go into the DOJ and explain all of these things, why these are reasonable efforts, and a blanket prohibition is not only impossible, but unnecessary.
So, Brian, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I was wondering if any of the listeners wanted more information or wanted to contact you directly, could they do so? And if so, how would they do it?
Oh, sure. So I can be contacted at my work email address, which is brian.burke@sherman.com, BRIAN.BURKE@SHEARMAN.com. I won't give out my WhatsApp or WeChat account because you can always contact me over email.
Well, Brian, I wanted to thank you very much. It's been a fascinating exploration of a relatively new and incredibly dynamic topic. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you later.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you have never given us a review on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you go to iTunes after you've listened to this episode and give us a review. It will definitely help in our rankings and help get the word out about this podcast. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks again for listening. I hope you'll join us again next week when I have another interesting guest on the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.